Hello, this is Bill Hoffman again, your professor for social problems, Sociology 1306, and I want to give you a brief introductory lecture to the study of social problems. This is a big picture view here. It starts to go into a little more detail with lecture 2 on poverty, and this won't be a long lecture because a lot of the material which is in chapter 1 of the textbook is covered a little bit differently probably in lecture 1 part 2, which I recorded a few weeks ago for my summer 1 course. Nothing has really changed. What I would mention is that that's not important. I'll mention that. It's mentioned within the lecture. However, there's one thing which I forgot. Well, yes, let me say that in the orientation, I said that it's not absolutely required that you read all of the textbook chapters because you're not going to be tested on anything that is in the textbook, but not in the other material I provided. I do want everyone to read chapter 1 of our free open source online textbook, though, because that's going to give you a perspective on the study of social problems, which is not really affected by the passage of time to the extent that the individual, the subjects of the individual chapters like poverty, race, ethnicity would be. That is, there aren't really any out-of-date statistics associated to any great extent with chapter 1 or with this introductory stuff. So the other thing I neglected to mention in the orientation is something very important in Canvas, which I'm going to show you. I'm going to share my screen now. All right, and I'll continue sharing it for the lecture. Okay, this is our course homepage. You will see on the left side here the syllabus. This is the best way to find the assignments, especially to see, definitely to find the due dates, because this is not really a syllabus in the same sense as you're used to seeing it. This is really a calendar of due dates. So don't wait until these dates to start. These are the dates the assignments are due. I'm going to open this and minimize this preview because it doesn't work well for me. So here we see the course summary, they're calling it, but it's a summary of due dates. Journal 1 due next Saturday. Meet and greet. So again, I mentioned this already in case you haven't watched the orientation yet. You don't have to do all of these discussions, and actually some of these you're seeing you won't see on your version of the syllabus. Let me go back and show you what you're going to see. Sorry about that. This will work too. I do have a student view. So this is, all right. So let's look at what the student view of the syllabus looks like. That's never going to open again. These discussions are not, you don't have to do all of them. You just have to do 6 of them. Not counting this one, everybody needs to do that one. That's worth 10 points by itself. The others will end up being worth 15 points each, but only 6. So you can only get 90 points plus the 10 for that. So you'll see pretty much they're all here already, and there are a number of discussions that you can participate in. Okay, and this is the best way to find out when something's due. For instance, let's take a look here. This is one of these special 25-point discussions. Just you can open it up from here. Video to watch about Bernie Madoff, a famous and imprisoned con man. On the topic of white-collar crime. So let's see what else we have. Syllabus and course navigation quiz. You need to take care of that pretty quickly. Locked until July 14th at 12. Oh, that's tonight. Well, no, it's Tuesday. But anyway, you'll have till July 21st to do it. You can't see it yet because it is locked. So I'm going to make sure that's unlocked on the 13th instead of the 14th. Okay, so Let's leave the student view, where I will do that thing I just mentioned. I'm going to edit that assignment. I know this is not what I promised you, but I want to make sure it is done. Okay. All right. I want this to be, there we go. Okay, now I'm going to start the lecture that I mentioned. Lecture 1, Part 1, Introduction to Social Problems. Here, as an example of a graphical, photographic illustration of some of the things we're going to be talking about racism, race, police violence. It's George Floyd. I'm sure you all know who he is now. This is a random homeless person, a person with COVID, the disease caused by the coronavirus. Is often called COVID-19 because it's the 19th coronavirus that has been identified, or coronavirus that can cause some sort of disease. Well, excuse me, pardon me, the 19 is from 2019 when the disease was identified. I'm sorry. I was thinking of another. The coronavirus itself is sometimes called SARS-CoV-2 because it's the second SARS type coronavirus that is has been identified. SARS stands for sudden acute respiratory syndrome. There are many coronaviruses, but thus far only 2 have been discovered which cause these severe respiratory problems associated with COVID. So this is an older photograph of nurses marching for the solution to a social problem, really, the problem of lack of affordable health care in the United States. They were advocating at this time, which was one of the few concrete proposals to come out of something called the Occupy movement, advocating for a tiny tax to be placed on all financial transactions. It's a tax first proposed by a Nobel Prize winning economist. The value of financial transactions, buying, selling stocks, buying, selling bonds, it completely dwarfs the real economy, the value of all the goods and services that are produced and sold and traded. So a tiny, tiny tax would produce enough money to fund a lot of other things. This group, National Nurses United, advocated using this tax to fund health care for everyone. Here's an older photo of a civil rights march. This is from Hurricane Harvey. We're going to be talking about environmental issues. Those do cause personal problems as well, as we can see here for a number of people. And if you were here during Harvey, you probably experienced some as well. So, social problems. What is a social problem? Well, social kind of relates to the group. Socius is the Latin for companion. The word sociology comes from that. So O-L-O-G-Y, Greek for the study of. So the study of our companions, sociology. But then there are personal problems, which are not social. They're just our own. But to what extent are our personal problems related to larger social issues, to the way that society is organized, social institutions function, and so forth? That's what we're really going to be talking about here. Because as you'll see in part 2 of this lecture, where I talk about sociological imagination, it's quite easy for someone to blame themselves for circumstances they find themselves in, which are really out of their hands. They're out of their control. They're the result of something that's happened at a higher level, the political sphere, the economic sphere. Blaming yourself for problems you can't solve is hazardous to your mental health. And it doesn't tend to really result, in most cases, in effective resolution of these problems. So some standard definitions. Our textbook, our free book with the author unknown, retracted, defines a social problem as any condition or behavior that has negative consequences for large numbers of people and that is generally recognized as a condition or behavior that needs to be addressed. Some other definitions from the Oxford Dictionary of Sociology: generic term, applied to a range of conditions and aberrant behaviors which are held to be manifestations of social disorganization and to warrant changing by some means of social engineering. The range of possible social problems is almost infinite. Those ellipses, the series of 3 dots, indicate I've skipped something in the definition, which is a list of examples. Lauer and Lauer have written a textbook we've used a lot at HCC, but not at the moment. They distinguish them from personal problems because, as I mentioned, the individual doesn't have that much control over the problems. They come from another level of human life and organization and experience. What I call systemic or structural social forces, but they still can affect you. And also they emphasize the quality of life of the individual is adversely affected. And allegedly our society, everyone is entitled to a certain level of equality of life, or at least to have the resources to work to achieve that. Max Weber, a sociologist that's very important and dead, used the term life chances, which are the odds that you're going to get what you value in life, which in a capitalist society such as we live in tends to be material prosperity. At the very minimum, it's a certain level of material comfort. So the existence of social problems contradicts, or some would say gives the lie to, many of the values that we hold dear, that we say that we embrace on paper, but the reality is otherwise. So here I'm going to share with you, I believe this is based on this textbook, so maybe this will eliminate some of your read. Actually, you should take a look at that. You're going to hear some of the same, a discussion that's in more depth on this distinction between social problems, personal problems, the components of social problems. So some examples: poverty, racism, gender discrimination, sexual assault, child abuse, crimes of violence against the LGBT community, white collar crime, which if you don't know what that is, you will learn about. Gentrification, perhaps you've heard that term, that refers to housing in the cities. The dwindling number of affordable places to live that result from wealthy, more affluent individuals moving into neighborhoods, rehabbing, remodeling older homes, driving up property values, and making that neighborhood less affordable for people of more modest means. The lack of affordable health care. If you don't have health care through your job and you have to buy it through the market, it is extremely expensive. Before the Affordable Care Act eliminated the ability of insurance companies to deny care on the basis of pre-existing health conditions, it was extremely expensive, and it still is, but you can no longer be denied a policy. It's just the expense may be great. So government corruption. Some say we saw an example of extreme corruption. Even someone in our, well, I won't go into politics now, but for instance, government corruption might be giving a pass to your friends when they've broken the law because you have the power to do so. So we had an example of that just in the past couple days, where a president commutes a sentence for someone that has been a close friend or associate or done a favor for that person. This political corruption has we've, you know, it's you find it throughout human history. Uh, so also climate change and other environmental problems. These are social problems. They're related to the massive flooding that we've had in recent years. 4 or 500 year floods in a 5-year period. Not normal. Social problems tend to intersect with each other. Quite often you'll hear the term marginalized groups. That means they're at the margins. They're out of the mainstream of prosperity, for instance. They are not as affluent. They may live in neighborhoods with few amenities in a food desert. They suffer from certain degrees of social exclusion where, for one reason or another, they are unable to access the resources that those who are more affluent typically get without even thinking about, you know, the privilege in many cases that they are enjoying. So because the values of our society suggest that everyone has access to a particular resource, when the reality is on the ground is different. So this concept of intersectionality, where you have to look at multiple factors to understand what's going on for a given individual. The term comes out of feminism and critical race theory, and it highlights the notion that an affluent white woman does not have the same experience in her social interactions with others as a poor white woman, or a poor transgendered woman, or a poor Latino male. They're different. And a poor Latino male and a wealthy Latino male do not have the same experiences as all Latinos. These groups are not monolithic, but the issues of discrimination, racism, differential access to resources, they all intersect. And there's more of what some people have called a matrix of oppression at work. An example concerns the field of the study of environmental justice and environmental racism, which we'll get to towards the end of the course. That's the intersection of race, class, and environmental issues like pollution, or the fact, you will find if you go to Texas City or Milby Park, you will find the refineries that dominate that area, the chemical plants that are polluting the air and water, and in a state where the regulatory structure is such that it's cheaper to pay a fine for polluting the air than it is to fix the problem which led to the pollution. You'll find largely communities of color, lower income communities that live around these plants and have to experience the lowered air quality. I worked for the state regulatory agency for a couple years and did fence line air quality monitoring around the state, including in Texas City. And I remember an incident in Texas City where it was probably 2 a.m. What we would do would be go ideally unannounced, but as soon as we were in these areas, word would spread among the plant operators and managers that the state was out taking measurements, and suddenly they'd all shut down for maintenance. So it never was as long an event as we had planned. But we were in a neighborhood in Texas City, just across the street from a chemical plant. And there was a residential area right on the side of the street we were parked on, really. People sleep in their homes, and the level of a chemical, hydrogen sulfide, a very deadly chemical because it smells like rotten eggs, very strongly. If you've ever smelled rotten eggs, you know what hydrogen sulfide smells like, because that's what you're smelling. It's a gas. I said chemical, which is the same thing. After you've breathed it for a little bit, you can't smell it anymore, but it's not gone. And if you continue breathing it at a certain level for about 10 minutes, you're likely to die. And it reached the level where we had to put on respirators to protect our safety. And here it's people asleep in their homes all around us. And I was told by people who'd been doing this longer than I that every year when they go to this place, they have the same violation of, and it was a violation of the state air and federal quality standards. They write them up and the lawyers work it out, and they may pay a fine, they may do something else, but year after year after year, it never changes. They just continue to violate the state laws such as they are, and nothing changes, and continue to put people's lives at risk. And at the very least, their inhalation of air pollutants is a much more serious problem than people tend to realize, because we're somewhat used to it in this area. People used to refer to that odor from the plants as the smell of money. It meant jobs, it meant profits. So some European studies recently make the claim that air pollution causes the premature death of more people than smoking cigarettes. And they're controlling for cigarette use, by the way, tobacco use. So that's apart from that. The Houston area is, well, I need not go on. The prevalence of asthma in children is far greater in areas near highways where you have a lot of pollution from vehicles, and it's definitely around these plants. I developed asthma working in Houston, over off in Pasadena off 225, working for Harris County Pollution Control, and I did not have childhood asthma, but I have it now. Through 4 years living in Houston was enough. So environmental justice, environmental racism. So social problems can overlap what we may think of as more scientific problems, particularly in the realm of public health. So I'm going to turn this video on. This is going to make my lecture less brief, but I'm just going to give you a taste of this. I'm going to have to stop my, let's see. There, share computer sound. All right, so here we go. This is by a mentor, graduate advisor of mine from UT Arlington.
From that class of people. I'm Salvatore Babonis, and today's lecture is Inequality and Health. Medicine may be a biological science, but public health is mostly a social science. And threats to public health are almost always, in the end, social problems, not scientific ones. The larger the scale you look at, the clearer it becomes that health problems are primarily social problems that are strongly shaped by inequalities in society as large. People don't die from inequality, but they do suffer from the ills of unequal societies. The worst of these ills may be the simple harshness of life in places where people just don't care for other people. Look, it's pretty obvious from a quick glance at the world that life expectancy is very unequally distributed. The life expectancy is highest in the dark blue countries in this map, in places like Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and it is lowest, of course, in sub-Saharan Africa and in conflict-ridden countries like Afghanistan. Much of this geographical distribution in good health, or at least living long, is related to countries' levels of income per capita. And so you'll see at low levels of income, countries below $5,000 or $10,000 per person per year, there's a steep rise in life expectancy as incomes rise. But among countries that have over $5,000 or $10,000 GDP per year, in countries like Costa Rica and Russia, life expectancy doesn't really rise as income continues to rise. It's pretty flat. It rises slowly or not at all. In fact, beyond a bare minimum, income just doesn't seem to make people live longer. GDP per capita, the indicator that we use to measure income, is really a catch-all for the quality of society. And once you have a reasonably good quality society, it no longer matters for life expectancy. So consider the example of Cuba. Cuba is one of those countries that is just at that point where increasing income no longer yields increasing levels of life expectancy. It has a GDP per capita of around $7,000 to $8,000 per year, right in that middle of that range of $5,000 to $10,000 per year. That means it's not a particularly rich country, but it does have very high life expectancy. 78 years compares pretty well with the developed countries of the world. Cuba would fit right in as a European or North American country with that level of life expectancy. Compare it to other countries around the region, and it does better than anywhere else in the Caribbean, much better than Haiti, which is close by, but even much better than the Dominican Republic, which, unlike Haiti, is a reasonably developed country with no civil war, and yet life expectancy in the Dominican Republic is 4 years lower than in Cuba. And really what it comes down to is that Cuba has a countrywide commitment to basic public health and to disaster preparedness that is shared by very few other countries. In fact, when we look at those developed countries, when we look at the richer countries of the world, life expectancy really...
Okay, we're going to get into some more complex material here, so I've stopped that there, and I'm going to go back to the lecture itself. Sorry about this problem here. All right, back. Okay. Anyway, if you want to see the rest of that video, it's there. We'll probably go revisit it when we get to the section on health. Racial and economic inequalities also intersect. Here is another short video. I'll bring that up a little bit. First, let me draw your attention to a graph. This only goes through 2016. It's from the U.S. Census Bureau that collects statistics on the population in the United States. See over time the median household income by race and Hispanic origin. Median means right in the middle. Half the households have a higher income, half the households in that group have a lower. So, and you can see that over time, these patterns of inequality have persisted from 67 to almost to the present. I guarantee you it's not much different now. So let's listen to this. This is more of a freelance.
How's everybody doing today? This is Antonio Moore coming to you from Tone Talks. I wanted to have a discussion today about black wealth, about the reality of black wealth in context of the overall American economy. One of my observations is that it's very clear that most, and meaning a large number of African Americans, really don't have a context of race and really the reality of what race has meant historically and how it impacts our lives today in terms of our overall wealth level. And without that understanding, you really can't operate in this system because you can't demand change, you can't demand anything until you know where you actually are and where you stand financially. We always talk about financial literacy, but we're using it incorrectly. We're talking about financial literacy in terms of learning the tools that white people use to grow their money, stocks, bonds, things of the sort, but we don't want to learn the reality of the financial landscape. And that's what I kind of want to do with this video. I don't want to go too long. This is kind of a short video here today, this weekend, and I just kind of want to explain things from a numerical standpoint. Before we start, please go to tonetalks.org. That's where you can donate. You can see all my articles I write on inequality.org, on the Grio, on Huffington Post, so many different your web, so many different little sites all around the web. And check out those articles. And you can check out my older videos. You can also donate through PayPal on that Tone Talks, TONETALKS.org. Please also subscribe to my YouTube channel here. Tone Talks is the name of the YouTube channel. You can just Google that. So getting right into it, one of the ways I want to frame this just before we get into the context of everything is when you look at American history, you have to understand that African Americans as a group have not been that free to be part of the economic like marketplace until rather recently, like a singular lifetime. America's the wealthiest country in the history of the world by far, produced half, if not more than half, of the richest people ever. And we basically were allowed to be free over a short period of time. I'm going to pull up a chart right now so you can kind of see that. If you look at America across like 4 quadrants of 1600, 1700, 1800, 1900, and then these 17 years of 2000s, what you find is the reality is we weren't really allowed to be part of the marketplace until well into the 60s and the 70s. And basically, we were used as tools to grow other people's wealth up until that point in one way or another, through whether it be actual slavery or slavery by another name, peonage, and things of the sort. We weren't really allowed to be free until Juneteenth, and so many of us don't understand that. We think we were freed since 1880, 1890, and it's just not true. And even during Jim Crow, we were shut out of wealth. And I think in many ways, that shows up in our wealth level today. Now, the problem isn't just our wealth level, it's that we basically compartmentalized our wealth level as though it's growing, not shrinking, one, which is wrong, and then as though we have some kind of personal power over the change, not government needs to change things. And that's not true either. The reality is, there's an article that I like for you guys to pull up that says that, the top 10% of white people own almost everything. And it only tells part of the narrative in that title, because the reality is that the real title should be white people own almost everything in America. And that's just the truth. And I think part of what makes this hard to see is the advent of the new kind of television. And that new kind of television pushes a narrative about diversity that wealth doesn't hold up to. It pushes a narrative that wealth is even, that wealth is something that everybody has access to, and that it's something that if you just try hard, everybody can get a chance. And it's just not true. When you look at wealth in America, what you really find is that, black people largely are locked out of wealth in this country. Now, unlike other groups, whether it be Latinos or different groups of Asians, what we don't have is a home country. So this is it. This is the game for us. When you look at this thing across a spectrum of who has the wealth, there's 80 million white homes. There's 14 million black homes. Of the 80 million white homes, 8 million, 10%, have 75% of all the wealth in this country. And it's growing. We're living through a time of calcification of wealth. These charts that I show is the last data they've released since 2013, 2014. It's actually worse now. But we'll use these as the baseline, but it's worse than this now. So what you find is that the top 10% or the top 8 million white households have $1 million or more. $2, $4, $6 million, sometimes $12, $20, $30 million. 8 million white households have that kind of wealth. And everything from, ranching and farming to military contracts to liquor stores to everything you can think of. And I think that in many ways we recreate a narrative as though we're a section of that top group, when actually we're a negligible sample. We're sample negligible in that group. We're not in that group. Now, what you find is that that group kind of sets a narrative for America to say, like, well, everybody's kind of cut out, and it's just still not true. One, because if you're white, you get to look like that group and traffic on the fact that people have to figure out whether you have money or not. The anonymity of wealth versus what black people go through, which is that people presume you don't have money because of the group's overall financial state, and then you got to prove that you have money, which people, end up having microaggressions and things of the sort. Microaggressions being little frustrations with what race means, instead of dealing with the overall context of what race means, because they were sold a bag of goods of diversity, and that's how they frame their whole psyche, is based on something that's just incorrect by every sense of the financial data. So moving along, what you find is that so if you were to look at America take all the families across 100 percentiles, so like, the 50th percentile is the key, because the bottom 50, from the 50th percentile family to the 90th percentile family, that section of American families has about 25% of the wealth. But we're really not part of that group either, African Americans. We're a very small section. We're maybe about 2% of that 25%. Our whole race, almost our whole race, is in the bottom 50th percent, and not even at the top level of that bottom 50%. I've shown you that the middle black family is worth $1,700, and I don't think that you really grasp what that means in terms of like how crazed we are in terms of the dreams we have versus the wealth level we have. I don't think that you're really digesting what this means for black families that are under, say, the age of 40, 45. Because basically the small group that is in the 50th to 90th percentile are mostly all boomers. This isn't like young blacks. Young blacks have been cut out of the American dream. And so, like, when I start to say this, I'm going to lay it out in data. I'm pulling up a chart that shows you, to get in the top 50% of America, the ticket in is about $85,000 to $100,000 in worth. Not earnings, not income, worth. The middle black family is worth $1,700 though. There's only, so if you look at this thing in terms of like numerics, there's 14 million black homes. That's it. There's 40 million blacks, we live in 14 million homes. There's about 180 million whites, and they live in 80 million homes. 8 million of their 80 own almost everything, like 75% of the pie. So for us, of the 14 million black homes, only 2 million are above the 50% like mark line. That's it. That is all. Just 2 million black homes are above the 50% mark line. Almost our whole race is in the bottom half of America. The part that only owns 1% of the wealth in this country. The black race is largely made up of black people that don't have any money. Now, what's a trip is that black people have not really digested that and adjusted their habits, their demands, or anything, because they really believe that they have the means that white people have. They also believe that there's this large section of white people that are just like them. And what you find is that we really don't understand, one, that we're a flat race economically. Pulling up another chart, you see what I mean. Like, if you look across this chart, what we are is we're flat across the whole race in terms of our wealth level, with a slight tier as you get up to about the 90th percentile. And also, those people in that slight uptick are all boomers. They're not young family-aged people. Our race, 12 million families, literally own probably less than 0.25% of all the wealth in this country, but have just the same dreams of Stanford and UCLA, as though we have a share much larger. And so, like, what I believe is that when television, when media started really projecting like this idea of diversity, they also had a group of blacks that came from the top, say about 300 to 500,000 black households out of a large section, millions of black, that said, I want to see a positive image of black families. But when they said they want to see a positive image, what they really started showing is aberration.
Blacks, all that matters. All that. All that. All that and all that matters. On CBS This Morning. All that matters. Every morning on CBS This Morning.
Basically anomalies. When you say blackish, when you show empire, what I'm telling you right now is it's not the middle family, it's not the top 10% family, it's not even the top 1% family. A lot of those families are the top 0.1% of all black America. What I'm telling you now is like the reality is black people themselves don't want to see the black middle class on television. Because the black middle class, like the black middle family, is worth $1,700. The problem is not just about positive imagery, it's about reality, and reality putting you in a place where you understand what you need to ask for and where you're at. Understand all the data I've shown you is before the great calcification of the last 3 years, 3 to 5 years. So it's worse now. This is the situation that we're in. Black wealth in this country is largely invisible. And I just wanted to lay that out for you just to kind of explain, because I get so many people that have answers that rely on the context of having a ticket into the game. The ticket into the game is in this country is about $100,000, $85,000 to $100,000. That's just to get the top seat. Like if you're looking at it from like a sports analogy, that's to get in the top seats, nosebleeds. $100,000 in worth for a family. That gets you out of the bottom 50%. We don't have a large group. We don't have any young people that are that way, and we have a very negligible sample of old people that are that way. I mean, when I say negligible, I'm talking about less than a 1.5 million out of the 14 million households, 2 million that have that kind of like wealth. And like I think for us, one of the dangers of this moment is we don't understand what undergirds a family, the kind of basic wealth that you need, and then as a result we don't move to the question of why we don't have that basic wealth, why we don't have $150,000 and just nest egg just for the basic stability of a family, and we're living off of like poverty, and in a sense making up a whole narrative that through this poverty we're going to see this great advancement. And I'm just here to say to you that that's not an adult way of living, and we need to live like adults now. And I hate to be the harbinger. I hate to bring to you such real news, but if you're framing this as bad news at the end of this video, that should tell you a lot of things are about to change for your psyche under Trump's new budget and tax cuts. I did a video about the tax cuts. Go check that out. And it's going to be a lot of changes that he's proposing. I just wanted to do a short video just to kind of explain the reality of like black wealth across a whole like spectrum of like financial realities in America, and give you a chance to see things laid out. There's 14 million black households. 12 million are in the bottom 50% of the country that owns less than 1% of the wealth.
Okay, so that was a different view. You notice he brought in another dimension there of inequality. Age. Talked about the boomers, and not all boomers are as well off as some of those you discussed, but that's another. What do you do to solve? Well, what can we do? Usually collective action. We need to work together or pressure the government, campaigns of one sort or another, marches, and typically, sometimes, in some historical periods, that's meant a revolution, a change in government. Typically, it's just reforms, though, changing the laws and so forth. We've heard a lot about police reform. Hasn't really happened, at least not at the federal level. There's partisan differences over what form the police reform bill should take. You will hear a lot of people debating social problems of one sort or another lately, obviously race, Racism, police violence is a big one. Healthcare has been a big one perennially. We still have, with all we've got facing us now, the economy, there's still climate change out there waiting for us to deal with. We're not doing any, how can we find time to give that a much attention right now? So, and often when you hear people debating it on the news or in a governmental setting, they are using some sociological theory that they have accepted and apply to understanding of these problems. Often those who are talking about reform are often kind of channeling the functionalist sociologists, like when they say, well, the solution to poverty is retraining people in skills that are needed in today's job market. That would be a reform. Whereas there's the conflict theorists, the critical theorists who might say, well, no, economic inequality is produced systematically by capitalism, and we need to do something about the way the capitalist system operates. So something systemic needs to be changed, not simply retraining individuals. So in part two of this, you'll be exposed to more of these sociological theories and the assumptions and beliefs, and I encourage you to pay a lot of attention to that because that will be useful in the rest of the class. Now, finally, often when you hear people on television, in the media, on social media, or even friends and neighbors making statements about social problems and what's the cause of poverty or climate change or such as any of these things, police violence, they may advance arguments that they believe and the words are understandable, but they don't always hang together logically. You hear a lot of logical fallacies expressed. So what is a logical fallacy? Fallacy basically kind of means something that is not true. It might seem to be, but it isn't. So, and it's quite common when you, for instance, if you say, for instance, well, people are poor because they don't want to work. That's you hear that from people, not as often as you used to, but you still will. Or if you're in a recession, I don't know if you've heard people have been thrown out of work right now. A lot of recessions are not nearly as bad as what we're going through. We're edging on, getting near the depression zone, actually. But I've been through several periods when jobs were scarce, were hard to find, but yet people would say, well, you're just not looking hard enough. That's where somebody ends up blaming themselves. Well, you may eventually internalize that. Well, I'm not looking hard enough, or I'm not good enough to get these jobs, or something like that, which is not the case. A lot of it's out of your hands. So it's important to be able to identify these fallacies. So I'm just going to go through a few of those. Logical fallacy argument seems to make sense, and it may have the form of something called a syllogism, which is an argument where you make two claims, and then if these two claims are both true, there's another thing that has to be true. If you've taken geometry, you've seen the syllogistic process in the term of doing proofs and so forth. Syllogism is a term that we give credit for that term to Aristotle. And in the West, it was always taught that Aristotle, it more or less systematized, invented what we call logic, this type of reasoned thinking from a premise, a belief, to a conclusion, or a set of premises, rather. Although, he wrote his work on logic in the 4th century BCE, or some people know that as BC, but basically the year, 322 to 400 years before the birth of the Western deity, at least the Jesus Christ had been for many years from the Middle Ages, from the European tradition. That birth, which didn't take place in the year 0, apparently the evidence is that Jesus was born in 4 BC, so 4 years, he was born 4 years before he was born, if you believe those calculations. This is going to something called Eurocentrism, seeing everything through the eyes of the European mind. So Europeans were predominantly Christians for most of history, still are, for the most part. Scholars began to realize, well, wait a minute, not everyone in the world is Christian. Why do we need all these historical dates stated in reference to the birth of someone from one religious tradition? So now they use, instead of BC, it's BCE. CE stands for the Common Era. So before the Common Era, it's still the same time. The year, there was no year zero, but you get the idea. And what used to be called AD is now called CD, the CE, the Common Era. So anyway, 200 years before Aristotle, there was an Indian, what's his name now? Anyway, there was an Indian logician, Madhahatita, I believe, Medhatithi, yes, 6th century BCE, different type of logic. Aristotle was dominant, though, for until really the 17th in the West, until the 18th century, 19th century, when some people began to develop symbolic logic and propositional logic. And I won't go into all that. You can take an entire course in logic if you wish, or just take philosophy and be introduced to it. But a syllogism, the classic one, was Socrates, a Greek philosopher. Socrates is a human. All humans are mortal, meaning they all die. So if Socrates is a human and all humans die, it has to be true that Socrates will die, right? That's a syllogism. That's syllogistic reasoning. Deduction from the premises. Okay, well, logical fallacies may look like that, but there's something wrong with the argument. A common one is something called a non sequitur, which is Latin for does not follow, meaning the conclusion does not follow from your premises. An example here, I have a cat named Jack, therefore climate change is a hoax. Well, it looks like something like one of those arguments, but there's no connection between those things. It doesn't make sense. Those are all over the place. They can be hard to spot. Some other kinds of logical fallacies. This is a common one, particularly, post hoc ergo propter hoc, more Latin, means it follows, therefore it's caused by. Because something happens immediately before something else, you think it caused something else. Well, that's not always the case. You can probably think of some examples of that. Appeals to opinion. Most people believe it, so it must be true. In Latin, that's argumentium ad populum. Appeal to authority. Some expert says it's true, so it has to be true. Engineers in our agency all agree that toothpaste causes cancer, so it must be true. In this case, it's the wrong kind of expert, perhaps. Then there's appeal to force. That's a common one. You have to believe this way or we'll put you in jail or do something else to you. That's just force. A couple others are the fallacy of composition, where what's true of the individual parts of something is true of the whole. For instance, you find someone who's committed, I'm trying to think of a good example now. Let's say you find someone who voted Democratic in the last election and then also got a DWI, was arrested for driving while intoxicated. So you reasoned that, well, all Democrats drive when they've been drinking. No, that's not. That's the fallacy of composition. These things are usually more subtle than that. There's the opposite, the fallacy of division. What's true of the whole is true of each of the parts, sometimes called the ecological fallacy. A famous example of this fallacy being pointed out in a sociological publication, someone did a survey of various cities and suicide rates and the popularity of country western music, and determined that in cities, in one city in particular, I think they focused on, was not all cities, but Nashville was the example that I read about in this particular paper. Nashville had a higher suicide rate than any other city, or really actually, I think it was multiple cities, and they found out that where country western music was more popular, you tended to have a higher suicide rate. So this almost is related to this post hoc or propter hoc. I listened to country music and then I went out and took my own life. Well, the problem there is you don't know that it's the same people listening to country music that are committing suicide. You don't know that. The study didn't go to that level. So that's saying what's true of the whole city is true of the individuals in the city. So that's really where I'm going to stop now. I think that's enough for one so-called brief introductory lecture. I thank you for your time.